Right. Even in defeat, the Republican connection served Frankfurter well. With the New York governorship out of reach, Stimson agreed, with Theodore's blessing, to become President William Howard Taft's Secretary of War. Stimson took Frankfurter with him to Washington as what today would be called his special assistant. The job did not exist then, so Frankfurter was officially made legal advisor in the Bureau of Insular Affairs. This was a political appointment to the executive branch, one focused on America's recently acquired empire in the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. In his capacity as legal advisor, Frankfurter argued several cases in the Supreme Court, making a good impression there. For the first time in his life, he also experienced notable social success. He roomed with a group of bright and energetic young men, most of whom worked in the administration. One was a young lord who worked in the British Embassy and provided extra tone. The men dubbed their group apartment the House of Truth, and invitations to their cocktail parties and dinners achieved a certain Washington cachet. Their regular guests included ambassadors, cabinet officials, and justices of the Supreme Court. Frankfurter got the thrill of his life when Justice Horace Lurton told him, "I hope you mix drinks as well as you argue cases." Then, sipping the cocktail Frankfurter had handed him, Lurton lowered the boom. "You mix drinks even better than you argue cases." For a Jewish immigrant who was not yet 30 years old, Frankfurter's life in Washington was heady stuff, a sign of the opportunity that an increasingly egalitarian society could provide to a young man of promise. Not by coincidence, while in Washington, Frankfurter first met and began to pursue the woman who would be, in 1919, his wife. Marion Denman was a recent Smith College graduate. The daughter of a congregational minister from an old New England family, she was high-strung and highly intelligent. She had studied social work and was interested in politics. Auburn-haired and hazel-eyed, Marion put admirers in mind of a Renaissance Madonna. Even in flats, she was a head taller than Frankfurter. The relationship was rocky from the start. Denman was flattered by Frankfurter's attention, but worried that she might be overwhelmed by his dominating personality. You threaten the securities of a person whose securities are only in the making and will never be better than slow and painful. At first reassuring, Frankfurter then backed away, telling Marion he could not marry her because he was not Jewish. She was not Jewish. "I suppose it resolved itself into a choice between you and mother. To understand, you will remember all that clusters around the traditions of thousands of years of Jews." But Frankfurter then reversed himself again, and the two were eventually married. Frankfurter's mother did not attend the wedding. In 1912, Taft ran for re-election, and Stimson supported the president who had appointed him. Frankfurter, still under Theodore Roosevelt's spell, supported the former president's third-party run quietly, without quitting the administration. When the split Republican vote helped elect Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, Frankfurter's mentor, Stimson, was out of a job. Frankfurter stayed out in the War Department while he tried to figure out what to do next. There, Frankfurter encountered Franklin Roosevelt, whose own rise to Washington prominence had been even more meteoric than his own. Despite his family ties to Theodore, Franklin remained on the sidelines in the presidential election and was now a Democrat in good standing. Having spent all of 2 years in the New York State Senate, he went to Washington to seek a job in the new Democratic administration. He pulled it off, getting appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a plum position. At 30, Roosevelt was a member of Woodrow Wilson's sub-cabinet. Frankfurter left Washington in 1914 to become the first Jewish professor at Harvard Law School. In 1917, though, as the United States entered the war, Frankfurter was invited back to the War Department, where he had made many Democratic friends. This time he served as chairman of the War Labor Policies Board, a body that had the task of handling labor relations for the production of munitions and other materiel during World War I. The job was especially delicate and important because many of the unions opposed the war. Roosevelt, still Assistant Secretary of the Navy, served on the board with Frankfurter. Now the acquaintances were colleagues. They saw each other professionally with some frequency, and their offices were near each other in the grand, high-ceilinged State, War, and Navy building, which still stands next to the White House. Roosevelt even invited Frankfurter to lunch with his wife Eleanor, and who was still a long way from the broad-minded humanitarian the world would learn about later. In her letter to her snobbish mother-in-law, she delivered a decidedly mixed verdict on Frankfurter, an interesting little man, but very Jewish. At war's end, the men's paths diverged again. Frankfurter went back to Cambridge. Over the next decade, he threw himself into a series of controversial and high-profile projects that would make him a national figure. The young professor was already identified with organized labor because of his role on the Wilson administration. At the president's direction, Frankfurter had participated in 2 high-profile investigations of wartime labor disputes. Each of his public reports reflected sympathy for workers. In one, Frankfurter detailed the way that copper mine owners in Bisbee, Arizona, had deported 1,000 striking workers to New Mexico, leaving them in the desert without water or supplies.
Didn't get it too fast.
Okay. And that was 160.